On September 19th, 1947, a battered warship broke her tow lines in a storm off Cornwall and ran aground on the rocks near Land's End. HMS Warspite, veteran of Jutland, terror of the Mediterranean, survivor of countless battles across 30 years, had finally met something she couldn't fight: the scrapyard and the weather. She'd been sold for scrap after the war, destined to be cut apart and melted down like any other obsolete vessel. But even in defeat, Warspite refused to go quietly. She broke free during the tow ran herself aground and resisted salvage efforts for years. It took nearly a decade to fully dismantle her, as if the ship that had survived everything the German and Italian navies could throw at her wasn't about to surrender to acetylene torches without a fight. This is the story of the most battle-hardened warship in Royal Navy history. A ship that fought at Jutland in 1916 and bombarded Normandy in 1944, that was hit by more shells, bombs, torpedoes and mines than any other British warship, and never once struck her colours, that earned more battle honours than any vessel in the fleet. And that became so legendary, her crew called her the Grand Old Lady, with affection that bordered on worship. Warspite was launched on November 26, 1913, at Devonport Dockyard, one of the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships that represented the cutting edge of naval design. She displaced 27,500 tons, mounted 8 15-inch guns in 4 turrets, could make 24 knots, and burned oil instead of coal. This last feature was revolutionary. Oil fuel provided more energy per ton than coal, required smaller crews for handling, and allowed faster refueling. But it also made the Royal Navy dependent on foreign oil supplies, a strategic vulnerability that caused considerable debate in Parliament. The Queen Elizabeth-class design philosophy emphasised speed and firepower over armour. Previous battleships had been slower, but more heavily armoured. The Queen Elizabeths were fast battleships capable of operating with battlecruisers while mounting battleship-caliber guns. This made them extraordinarily versatile, but also exposed them to risks that slower, more armoured vessels might survive more easily. Warspite commissioned in March 1915 and joined the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow. Her first year of service was frustrating. The German High Seas Fleet remained in port, avoiding battle, while the Grand Fleet maintained distant blockade, waiting for the Germans to sortie. The strategic situation favoured the British. They controlled the North Sea exits, strangling German maritime trade. The Germans needed to break the blockade, but couldn't risk their fleet against British numerical superiority. The result was stalemate, broken occasionally by skirmishes that resolved nothing. That changed on May 31st, 1916, when the German High Seas Fleet sortied in force, attempting to trap and destroy a portion of the Grand Fleet before British reinforcements could arrive. Admiral John Jellicoe led the Grand Fleet south to intercept. The resulting Battle of Jutland became the largest naval engagement of World War I. 250 ships, over 100,000 men, 14 hours of combat spread across hundreds of square miles of North Sea. Warspite's baptism of fire came in the most violent phase of the battle. At approximately 4:00 p.m, British battlecruisers under Admiral Beatty were retreating northward, drawing the German fleet toward Jellicoe's battleships. Warspite was part of the 5th Battle Squadron supporting the battlecruiser force. She engaged German battlecruisers at ranges exceeding 20,000 yards, her 15-inch shells straddling targets barely visible through smoke and spray. Then her steering jammed. The exact cause was never fully determined, either battle damage to the steering gear or mechanical failure, exacerbated by violent manoeuvring. Warspite began turning in circles, unable to maintain course. Drifting toward the German battle line, she presented a perfect target, effectively stationary, while German battleships concentrated fire. Shells hit her repeatedly. One 12-inch shell penetrated near the waterline, flooding compartments. Another destroyed her starboard secondary battery. A third hit the funnel, showering the deck with fragments. Her list increased as flooding worsened. Fires broke out on the superstructure, but Warspite's main armament kept firing. Her gun crews maintained discipline despite the ship circling helplessly under concentrated fire. She hit German battleship Bayern twice, forcing her to break off. She put shells into Kaiser and Markgraf. The German fire intensified at least 13 heavy-caliber hits, plus numerous smaller shells. Casualties mounted, flooding increased. The ship was dying. Then, as suddenly as it had jammed her steering partially freed, engineers had bypassed the damaged steering gear, restoring limited control through emergency systems. Warspite came back on course and withdrew from the German battle line, listing burning but still making way. She'd survived an encounter that should have sent her to the bottom. The damage was severe enough that she had to withdraw from the battle, but she reached port under her own power. 13 major hits, over 100 casualties, and she was still afloat. The repairs took months. The steering system was rebuilt. Shell damage was patched. But something more important had been established. Warspite was incredibly tough. Ships hit as many times as she'd been didn't usually survive. The combination of her design, the Queen Elizabeth-class armor scheme, protected vital spaces effectively, and the professionalism of her damage control parties had saved her. The ship had a reputation now. She could take punishment. Warspite spent the remainder of World War I with the Grand Fleet participating in operations, but never again engaging German capital ships. The High Seas Fleet stayed in port after Jutland, the battle having demonstrated that they couldn't defeat the Grand Fleet in open engagement. The blockade continued. Germany slowly strangled. When the armistice came in November 1918, the High Seas Fleet surrendered and was interned at Scapa Flow, where the Germans scuttled their own ships, rather than let them be distributed to Allied navies. Peace brought challenges the Royal Navy hadn't anticipated. Defence budgets collapsed. The fleet that had dominated the oceans through World War I was too expensive to maintain. International arms limitation treaties, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and London Naval Treaty of 1930, imposed strict limits on battleship tonnage and numbers. Ships became obsolete not through age, but through treaty restrictions. Many were scrapped or disarmed. Warspite survived the cuts, but was placed in reduced commission. Her crew minimised, her maintenance deferred. The interwar years were unkind to Warspite. She ran aground in 1919 near the Scottish coast, requiring dry dock repairs. Budget constraints meant systematic maintenance was postponed. By the early 1930s, she was approaching obsolescence. Her fire control systems were outdated. Her anti-aircraft armament was inadequate for modern air threats. Her machinery needed overhaul. The Royal Navy faced a choice: scrap her or conduct extensive modernisation. Given the deteriorating international situation and the need for capital ships, they chose modernisation. The reconstruction completed between 1934 and 1937 transformed Warspite. Engineers removed her old machinery and installed new turbines and boilers, increasing power and reliability. Her deck armour was strengthened against plunging shell fire and aerial bombs. Her fire control systems were replaced with modern equipment, including advanced rangefinders and ballistic computers. Her secondary armament was upgraded with dual-purpose guns, effective against both surface and air targets. Her superstructure was rebuilt. Her anti-aircraft battery was massively expanded, and she received aircraft catapults for reconnaissance planes. She emerged from reconstruction as essentially a new ship with better armour, more power, superior fire control, and modern anti-aircraft defences. The cost approached half of what building a new battleship would have required, but the result was a vessel that could operate effectively in modern combat conditions. More importantly, the reconstruction was completed in 1937, just in time for the crisis that would become World War II. When war began in September 1939, Warspite was assigned to the Mediterranean Fleet. But the opening moves of the war occurred in northern waters, and Warspite was dispatched to join operations against German forces in Norway. The Norwegian campaign was a disaster for Allied forces on land. German invasions succeeded despite British and French intervention. But at sea, the Royal Navy demonstrated what superior training and aggression could accomplish, even when surprised and outnumbered. On April 10, 1940, Warspite led a force of destroyers into Ofotfjord, near Narvik, where German destroyers had landed troops to capture the strategic port. The Germans had already fought one engagement with British destroyers, sinking 2 while losing 2 of their own. They expected the British wouldn't return. They were wrong. Warspite entered the narrow fjord at battle stations. Her 15-inch guns loaded reconnaissance aircraft launched to spot targets beyond the headlands. The confined waters negated many of Warspite's advantages. She couldn't maneuver freely, couldn't use her speed, was exposed to torpedo attacks from multiple directions. But the German destroyers faced their own problems. They were low on fuel and ammunition after the previous engagement and the invasion operations. More critically, they were destroyers facing a battleship. The engagement was lopsided from the start. Warspite's first salvo destroyed German destroyer Erich Koellner at 16,000 yards a shot that demonstrated her fire control's effectiveness even in confined waters. Her second salvo crippled Erich Gieser. The German destroyers scattered, seeking cover behind headlands and attempting to reach Warspite with torpedoes. None succeeded. The British destroyers accompanying Warspite hunted down German vessels hiding in side fjords. Warspite's reconnaissance aircraft spotted and bombed submarine U-64, sinking her, the first U-boat sunk by aircraft from a battleship. Within 2 hours, 8 German destroyers were destroyed or scuttled. The survivors ran themselves aground or surrendered. Warspite emerged from the engagement with minimal damage. Some splinter hits from near misses, nothing serious. She demonstrated that properly employed battleships remained devastatingly effective, even in the age of air power and submarines. The key was aggressive action and superior training. German destroyers were excellent vessels, but they couldn't compete with a battleship in gun range and hitting power. The victory at Narvik became one of the Royal Navy's clearest successes of the Norwegian campaign. While Allied ground forces failed to hold Norway, the Navy had destroyed a significant portion of the German destroyer force losses. The Kriegsmarine couldn't easily replace. Warspite's role in the victory enhanced her reputation. She wasn't just a veteran survivor from World War I. She was a current relevant combat unit capable of decisive action. Warspite returned to the Mediterranean in summer 1940, just as Italy entered the war. The Mediterranean became a contested battleground where British and Italian fleets fought for control of supply routes to North Africa and the Middle East. The Italian Navy possessed modern battleships and heavy cruisers, numerical superiority in many vessel classes, and the advantage of operating close to their bases with land-based air support. The British Mediterranean fleet was outnumbered, but led by Admiral Andrew Cunningham, who believed aggressive action could overcome numerical disadvantages. On March 28, 1941, reconnaissance reported Italian fleet units south of Crete battleship Vittorio Veneto, heavy cruisers and destroyers attempting to intercept British convoys. Cunningham sortied from Alexandria with Warspite battleships Barham and Valiant aircraft carrier Formidable and screening forces. The Battle of Cape Matapan followed a running engagement where British carrier aircraft damaged Vittorio Veneto and crippled heavy cruiser Polar with torpedo hits. The Italian fleet commander detached cruisers Zara and Fiume with 4 destroyers to assist the crippled Polar. Cunningham's battleships pursued through the night using radar to track the Italian formation. The Italians without radar were unaware British battleships were closing to point-blank range. At 10:25 p.m., Warspite searchlights illuminated cruiser Fiume at less than 4,000 yards. What followed was slaughter. Warspite's 15-inch broadsides hit Fiume. Within seconds, the shells passing completely through the cruiser at such close range. The Italian ship exploded and sank within minutes. Zara attempted to return fire, but was similarly destroyed by concentrated fire from all 3 British battleships. The accompanying destroyers tried to launch torpedoes, but were blown apart before they could attack effectively. Within minutes, 3 Italian cruisers and 2 destroyers were sunk or sinking. Over 400 Italian sailors died. British casualties were trivial, 1 aircraft lost. Cape Matapan demonstrated what battleships could still accomplish against surface forces in night action. The radar advantage gave British ships decisive superiority. They could see the enemy while remaining invisible themselves. The firepower advantage meant that once Italian ships were illuminated, they died almost instantly. The battle devastated Italian naval morale. Their fleet became increasingly reluctant to risk engagements with British forces ceding maritime initiative despite numerical superiority. For Warspite, Cape Matapan added another chapter to her legend. She'd been the first to open fire. Her salvos destroyed Fiume, and her contribution was decisive. The crew's confidence in their ship grew. The grand old lady had proven herself again. But the Mediterranean War was far from over, and the cost would be high. German intervention in the Balkans forced British evacuation from Greece and Crete. Luftwaffe aircraft, operating from Greek bases, subjected British ships to sustained air attacks during these evacuations. Warspite participated in operations off Crete in May 1941, providing anti-aircraft cover for troop evacuation convoys. The German air attacks were relentless waves of bombers and dive bombers, striking at ships that couldn't maneuver freely in confined waters. On May 22, 1941, German dive bombers found Warspite off Crete. 2 500-pound bombs hit her. The first struck near the starboard 4-inch and 6-inch batteries, penetrating the deck and exploding inside the ship. The second hit further forward, destroying a secondary director and causing extensive fires. Over 100 casualties resulted, including many killed. The damage was severe. Flooding fires, destroyed weapons systems, casualties that overwhelmed the medical facilities. But Warspite continued operating. Her main armament remained functional. Her machinery continued running. She withdrew from the immediate combat zone to conduct emergency repairs, then returned to Alexandria for proper dry docking. The repairs took months, and she was out of action through the critical summer and fall of 1941, when German forces approached Egypt and the Mediterranean fleet fought to keep supply lines open. This pattern, repeated through the war, Warspite would take damage that would cripple most ships, conduct repairs, and return to combat. She was hit by bombs again in 1943, during operations supporting the Italian invasion. She struck a mine in the English Channel in 1944 while supporting D-Day bombardment operations, blowing off part of her bow and requiring extensive repairs. She was hit by German radio-controlled bombs, early guided missiles off Salerno in September 1943, suffering severe damage that required her to be towed to port. Each time her crew expected the ship to be written off as beyond economical repair. Each time the Admiralty decided she was too valuable to lose and authorized repairs. Each time Warspite returned to combat. The ship became a symbol of British resilience, repeatedly battered, repeatedly written off, repeatedly returning stronger. The statistics accumulated over her career were extraordinary. Warspite earned 15 battle honours, more than any other Royal Navy warship. She fired her 15-inch guns in anger in both world wars. She engaged enemy surface ships across 4 decades of service. She was hit by at least 15 major weapons shells, bombs, torpedoes, mines, and survived them all. She served in more campaigns and major engagements than any contemporary British warship. By 1944, Warspite was nearly 30 years old, ancient by warship standards. Modern battleships like the King George V class were faster, better armoured, and more capable. But Warspite remained in service because she was reliable. Her crew was experienced, and she could still deliver devastating firepower. For the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, she was assigned to bombardment duties, using her 15-inch guns to destroy German fortifications that threatened landing beaches. The Normandy bombardment represented a different kind of naval warfare than Warspite had been designed for. Instead of ship-to-ship engagements, she was firing at land targets, bunkers, artillery positions, troop concentrations. The ranges were shorter than open ocean gunnery, but the accuracy requirements were more stringent. Hitting another ship at 20,000 yards was one thing, hitting a specific bunker at 15,000 yards, while avoiding friendly forces 500 yards away was another. Warspite excelled. Her experienced gun crews could put shells through bunker slits. Her fire control systems, modernized through multiple reconstructions, could engage multiple targets in rapid succession. British Army units ashore requested her fire repeatedly, trusting her accuracy more than they trusted other naval gunfire support. She fired hundreds of rounds in support of ground forces, destroying German positions that conventional artillery couldn't reach. But on June 13, 1944, her war nearly ended. While operating off Normandy, she struck a mine, likely a German pressure-activated mine designed to detonate under a ship's keel. The explosion was catastrophic. It blew a massive hole in her hull, flooded multiple compartments, and caused severe structural damage to her bow. The ship took on thousands of tons of water and developed a dangerous list. Her captain considered abandoning ship. The damage control party saved her. They sealed bulkheads, shored up damaged structures, pumped out flooded compartments, and gradually stabilized the ship. Warspite made it back to port under her own power barely. The damage was assessed as potentially terminal. Her bow was barely attached to the rest of the hull. The structural stress had caused cracks throughout her forward sections. Repairing her would require extensive dry dock time and resources that might be better spent on newer ships. But again, the Admiralty authorized repairs. Warspite was too valuable symbolically and too effective practically to discard. The repairs took months and weren't completed until late 1944. She returned to bombardment duties this time in the Mediterranean, supporting operations on the Italian coast. But her machinery was wearing out. Boiler problems reduced her speed. Mechanical failures became more frequent. She was literally worn out. 30 years of hard service in 2 world wars had finally exceeded even her extraordinary durability. In 1945, as the war in Europe wound down, Warspite's operational career ended. She was placed in reserve. Her crew reduced, her systems shut down. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, her war was already over. She'd served from Jutland to Normandy from 1916 to 1945 in every major theatre where the Royal Navy fought. No other battleship could claim a similar record. The peacetime Royal Navy had no place for 30-year-old battleships. Britain was bankrupt from the war. The fleet required drastic reductions. Modern ships like the King George V class would be retained. Older vessels, regardless of their records, would be scrapped. Warspite was sold for scrap in 1947. Her final voyage was supposed to be a simple tow to a scrapyard, an ignominious end for the most decorated warship in the fleet. But Warspite had one last battle in her. During the tow, in a storm off Cornwall, she broke her tow lines and ran aground near Land's End. Salvage attempts failed repeatedly. She sat on those rocks for years, resisting all efforts to refloat her. Eventually, salvage crews were forced to cut her apart, where she lay, a process that took until 1956 to complete. Even in death, the grand old lady refused to go quietly. Her crew members, scattered after demobilization, maintained contact for decades. They formed associations, held reunions, and kept her memory alive. Many described serving aboard Warspite as the defining experience of their lives. They'd been part of something extraordinary, a ship with a soul, a vessel that seemed to have a will to survive, that transcended steel and machinery. The technical explanations for Warspite's survivability are straightforward. Her design was sound. The Queen Elizabeth-class armour scheme protected vital spaces effectively. Her machinery was reliable. The interwar reconstruction gave her modern propulsion and systems. Her damage control procedures were excellent. British naval training emphasised damage control, and Warspite's crew became experts through hard experience. Her luck held. She was hit repeatedly, but never in a way that caused immediate catastrophic failure. But these explanations don't fully capture why Warspite became legendary. Other battleships had good design and trained crews. Other ships survived heavy damage. What made Warspite unique was the accumulation 30 years of continuous service, 15 battle honours, survival of attacks that should have sunk her participation in every major naval campaign of 2 world wars. She became more than a ship. She became a symbol of endurance, of refusal to quit, of determination to keep fighting regardless of damage or age or obsolescence. When the Royal Navy compiled its list of the most distinguished ships in its history, Warspite's name stood at the top. More battle honours than any other vessel, service in more campaigns, survival of more combat damage, a career that spanned the age of dreadnoughts through World War II, from coal-fired turbines to radar and guided missiles. She saw technologies emerge mature and become obsolete, and she adapted to all of them. The ship's reputation influenced her crew's performance. Men assigned to Warspite knew they were joining a legendary vessel. That knowledge affected morale, discipline, and determination. When damage hit and conditions looked hopeless, crews remembered that Warspite had survived worse before. That memory became self-fulfilling. They fought harder to save the ship because they believed she could be saved, and their efforts proved that belief correct. Modern naval historians debate whether battleships remained relevant by World War II or had been superseded by aircraft carriers and submarines. Warspite's career provides evidence for both positions. She survived multiple air attacks, which supporters of battleships cite as proof that properly defended battleships remained viable. But she required extensive anti-aircraft batteries, fighter cover, and luck to survive those attacks, which critics cite as proof that battleships had become obsolete in the face of air power. What's undeniable is that Warspite remained effective throughout her career. At Narvik, she demonstrated that battleships could dominate surface actions in confined waters. At Cape Matapan, she proved that radar-equipped battleships could devastate enemy forces in night action. At Normandy, she showed that naval gunfire support remained crucial for amphibious operations. She adapted to every mission requirement and performed effectively, even when 30 years old and technically obsolete. Her final years rusting on Cornish rocks while salvage crews worked to dismantle her seemed tragic, but somehow fitting. The ship that had survived everything the German and Italian navies could throw at her wasn't going to surrender easily to scrapyard workers. She made them work for it, resisting to the end, forcing them to cut her apart piece by piece over nearly a decade. The grand old lady's story is ultimately about endurance. Not just the ship's endurance, though, that was remarkable, but the endurance of the men who served aboard her, the Admiralty that kept repairing her when logic said to scrap her, and the tradition she represented. She connected the Grand Fleet at Jutland to the D-Day bombardment force, linked two world wars through continuous service, and embodied British naval determination through the darkest periods of both conflicts. When Warspite finally disappeared, cut apart and melted down in foundries, something irreplaceable was lost. Ships had fought longer. Some vessels from the Age of Sail served for over a century. Ships had been more technologically advanced. Ships had been more beautiful or faster or more powerful. But no ship in the Royal Navy's long history combined longevity, combat effectiveness, survival against impossible odds, and symbolic importance the way Warspite did. She fought at Jutland when dreadnoughts were new. She bombarded Normandy when battleships were obsolete. She survived both experiences and everything in between. That's her legacy, not invincibility, but endurance, not perfection, but determination, not the newest or best, but the toughest ship that ever wore the white ensign. The grand old lady earned her nickname through 30 years of war, and she wore it with pride until the very end.